Liverpool.
My Lords, I begin by expressing my thanks to colleagues on the crossbenches for choosing this motion for debate, but also to the many members of the House from all parts of the House who are participating today, all of whom bring significant expertise and knowledge to our proceedings, including the Noble Lord Purvis, the sponsor of the 2015 International Development Official Development Assistance Target Act, and former ministers, including my long-standing friends, Lady Chalker and Lady Northover, and Baroness Sugg, who, with great principle and honour, resigned her post in protest at the abnegation of the Act. I'd also like to thank the Library for the excellent note prepared in advance of the debate and draw attention to my role as an officer of several relevant all-party parliamentary groups. My Lords, in 1970, as a student, I campaigned for the implementation of Resolution 2626 of the United Nations, urging developing nations to raise their aid contribution to 0.7%. And in 7 parliamentary elections, which I contested in Liverpool, always committed myself to voting in Parliament to supporting that target. This motion enables us to reiterate our commitment to what is, after all, a long way short of the injunction to tithe, to drill down into the integrated review's objective to be a force for good in the world, and to ask how that claim can be squared with a precipitous cut in development aid from 0.7% of GNI to 0.5%. I hope that the Noble Lord the Minister will tell us whether he agrees that the estimate of a £4 billion cut in real terms is correct. In response to today's debate, the Minister will be pressed on the central question, whether the government intends to introduce legislation to reduce ODA funding this year, and if not, how it intends to ensure that the government is acting lawfully and in accordance with its statutory obligations. I particularly look forward to the speech of the Noble Lord Garnier, who will address that point further. Yesterday, my Lords, Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, appeared before the International Relations and Defence Select Committee of your Lordship's House. He has previously said, I quote, "We will need to bring forward legislation in due course." Does that remain the case? If the government's position now is that legislation won't be necessary because 0.7% will be restored when fiscal circumstances allow, can the Minister describe the fiscal criteria that will be used to permit a restoration to 0.7%? My Lords, by sleight of hand, temporary could, as we all know, so easily become permanent. The immediate fiscal criteria doesn't look very promising. The Office of National Statistics say that in 2020 we recorded our worst economic performance in more than 300 years, with the economy contracting by 9.9%. But if times are tough and require draconian cuts, how do we square these cuts in aid with the cost of increasing the number of nuclear warheads also announced in the review and in contravention of our non-proliferation commitments? Even before these drastic cuts in ODA, we were confronted with the reality of a smaller cake, but our spending priorities and life and death decisions should have been shaped by parliamentary scrutiny and informed by a review, and not, such as with the merger of DFID and the FCO, or swinging cuts in ODA, retrospectively be justified by one. As my noble friend Lord Haney said last week, the cart has preceded the horse. My Lord, circumventing legislation, avoiding scrutiny, curtailing debate, upending due process and good governance leads to bad decisions. Many of us are jealous of the role of Parliament, and we object when we see it diminished. Baroness Annelly of St John, the chair of the International Relations Committee, on which I serve, specifically points to what she calls the review's, and I quote, lack of consistency in the approach to relations with countries in Africa, and the failure to provide detail of the effects on individual countries. I hope that today the Minister could rectify that lack of detail, cut by cut, sector by sector, country by country. Concealing these details from Parliament is simply unacceptable. In a curious, largely undefined phrase, the review says, "We will be active in Africa." What will this mean in Tigray, in Anglophone Cameroon, in ravaged Mozambique, in South Sudan, in northern Nigeria, in combating the rise of jihadist ideology? And what is the review's justification for switching emasculated resources from West Africa and the Sahel? Ahead of this debate, I drew the Minister's attention to UN estimates that in the Horn of Africa, some 4.5 million Tigrayans urgently require emergency and life-saving assistance, but over 2.5 million children are malnourished. People are being starved to death, and in terrible massacres reminiscent of Darfur and Rwanda, there have been brutal killings, and an estimated 10,000 women have been raped. Unbelievably, some Tigrayans have fled to Yemen, believing that they will be safer. As the Noble Lord McConnell will no doubt remind us, development is impossible without conflict resolution. Is it the case that the Conflict Stability and Security Fund has been cut by a staggering £363 million, by 50%? That will merely add to the 70 million people displaced worldwide, making no sense in terms of our security, let alone humanitarian duties. My Lords, consider Yemen, where the FCDO's Chris Bold says aid has been cut by 50%. Millions are facing starvation and food insecurity. Around half of all children under 5 in Yemen, 2.3 million, are projected to face acute malnutrition in 2021. Nearly 400,000 are expected to suffer from severe acute malnutrition and could die if they don't receive urgent treatment. My Lords, no impact assessment was made of the effect of the cuts on vulnerable groups such as women, children, people with disabilities or displaced people. Why not? This is downright irresponsible. In an excoriating remark, Mark Lowcock, the UK's first special envoy for famine prevention, said, "We are trying," I quote, "to balance the books on the backs of starving people in Yemen." Bilateral programmes in Yemen, Syria and Sudan will be disproportionately affected, as it's harder to extricate the UK from multilateral programmes. So funding is lost merely because it's allocated through the wrong line. And yet, during yesterday's welcome session with the Foreign Secretary, he said that the government was not salami slicing. He was asked about his 7 strategic criteria for the FCDO: climate change, COVID, girls' education, science and technology, open societies, humanitarian assistance and trade. My Lords, measure the criteria against resources and the random way in which it's been done. Girls' education, an FCO priority, will be cut by 25%. Save the Children say that humanitarian preparedness and response will be cut by 44%, despite 200 NGOs warning that more than 34 million vulnerable people will face famine or famine-like conditions. CSWs say that funding for the newly formed Open Societies and Human Rights Directorate is set to fall by up to 80%. FCDO priorities of promoting freedom of religion or belief and media freedom no longer specifically appear in the criteria. Will their programmes be reduced? How will the John Bunyan Fund and the Magna Carta Fund be affected? This morning, my Lord, Sky News reported that a memo prepared for Minister Wendy Morton estimates that bilateral funding for water projects in developing nations will be cut by 80%. Clean water, hand washing and good hygiene are critical defences in the fight against coronavirus, which globally, of course, has claimed 3 million lives, and today we think especially of our friends in India. Since 2015, the UK has helped over 62.6 million people gain access to safe water and sanitation. That is something to be incredibly proud of, not to curtail. Ahead of Glasgow's COP26 summit on climate change, we mustn't lose focus on water security. My noble friend Lady Hayman will doubtless remind us of this and how our ODA contributes to the defence of the planet, with the Royal Society saying that we're weakening those defences with global programmes in science cut by their figures well over £500 million, with the UK no longer regarded, in their words, a reliable partner. And meanwhile, yesterday, DevEx reported that funding for polio eradication will be cut by a catastrophic 95%. Chatham House David Salisbury warned the slashed funding, I quote him, could threaten the eradication initiative. In 2019, Alok Sharma, the former International Development Secretary, rightly said, if we were to pull back on immunisations, we could see 200,000 new cases each year in a decade. This would not only be a tragedy for the children affected and their families, but also for the world. We cannot let this happen. So, my Lords, Why are we now letting it happen? In questions earlier this week, the Noble Lord Collins asked for details of how much ODA will be dedicated to the polio eradication programme, to the Gavi Vaccine Alliance and the Global Fund, and to nutrition programmes, and I hope he will be answered today. The race to buy up vaccines has merely underlined gross inequalities worthy of Lazarus and Dives. My noble friend Lord Crisp, the former Permanent Secretary to the Department of Health, will remind us that many British clinicians voluntarily provide support to their colleagues in low and middle-income countries such as Myanmar. It's essential that the FCDO holds to its commitment to support this vital work at this awful time in a country where, following the coup, medical staff are themselves targets for assassination. In addition, my lords, we should significantly improve arrangements for diaspora to send remittances from the United Kingdom to developing countries. Voluntary giving is personified by our flagship of voluntary services overseas, which, thanks in part to the efforts of my noble friend Lady Cousins and an intervention by the Select Committee, will receive a welcome extension of the V4D grant. But it will still sustain a 45% cut in funding, with, their words, over 4 million people losing access to VSO services, and with no ability to plan for the future of international youth volunteering and their international citizen service. And there are other extraordinary UK flagships, like the increasingly emasculated British Council and the courageous BBC World Service, its journalists persecuted and vilified in Iran, driven out of China for exposing genocide against the Uyghurs, breaking information blockades in North Korea and Myanmar. BBC World and the British Council, like VSO and our championing of the rule of law, which doubtless the noble Baroness Lady Kennedy of the Shawls will speak about, combine our values with global reach, fine examples of soft power, or what Joseph Nye dubbed as smart power. The review describes the UK's soft power as rooted in who we are as a country, central to our international identity as an open, trustworthy and innovative country, and that it helps us to build positive perceptions of the UK and to create strong people-to-people links. Yes, my lords, but how will we be perceived if we break commitments and carefully nurtured relationships and are seen to disregard our own laws and foolishly allow other actors, such as the CCP, to replace a country committed to the rule of law, human rights and democracy, with its authoritarian economic coercion and its use of debt bondage through its $770 billion Belt and Road projects, suborning countries and multilateral institutions? While I welcome the government's decision to finally cut aid to the regime of Chinese Communist Party by 95%, I'd be grateful if the Noble Lord the Minister could respond to today's report from the Independent Commission for Aid Impact. It says that last year, opaque arrangements and pockets of public money in multiple departments described as, I quote, a complex mosaic, led to a record £68.4 million being used as aid to China, up from 44.7 million in 2015. Why have we been doing this? Not least while the CCP is identified in the review as a systemic threat to the UK and its interests. My lords, to conclude, yesterday the Foreign Secretary emphasised the importance of transparency, of an integrated approach and value for money. Transparency will be assisted by a commitment today from the Noble Lord the Minister to publish all planned spending of UK aid in 2021-22 and to resist the usual default that we will learn more in due course. Programmes cannot be planned and implemented on that haphazard and erratic basis. The integrated review insists that we are one of the world's leading development actors, committed to the global fight against poverty, to achieving the SDGs by 2030, and to maintaining the highest standards of evidence and transparency for all our investments. It promises a new international development strategy from which, from next year, will realign the UK aid with what it calls a strategic framework, and about which we will hope to hear more. To achieve all of that, it will be crucial to restore the commitment to 0.7%. We should do this because it's in our national interest, but also because it's morally the right thing to do. Generous altruism and self-interest are two sides of one coin. All 5 of the UK's former Prime Ministers have called on the government to think again. I hope that this debate, with such an impressive array of formidable speakers, will reinforce that call. I beg to move.